How's it going, everybody? Today I'm going to show you 10 tips that are going to make you a better disc golfer. Now, I may not be the perfect disc golfer, but I've picked up on a lot of things in the last 10 years and I've compiled a lot of different tips that have helped me out. I've done a few videos like this before, but I've got 10 more tips, some new ones that I think are going to make a big difference in your game. I'm out here at Sandusky Park. I'm going to play 10 holes alongside those tips to keep things interesting. Without further ado, let's get into tip number one. Tip number one is quite simple, but gets ignored a ton on the course, even by the pros, and that is footing is a factor. That's a pretty good throw. Ooh, almost an ace to start off the day. Now, there are a number of things to unpack, and it starts with, what am I wearing on my feet? Now, disc golf may not have a specific shoe, but footwear does make a difference. Right now, I'm rocking the Vivo barefoot shoes. I've really enjoyed these, but really what it comes down to is picking out a shoe that works for you, both with comfort and the grip it's going to give you on the course. That's a very important factor. Having a shoe with some kind of tread on the bottom, a lot of times you're going to find those in a trail running type of shoe, is very helpful, gives you more traction, and can help you perform better on the course because slipping is not what you want. The next thing to consider is, what does your footing look like as far as the surface you're on? Are you standing in mud like I am right now? Is the tee pad you're standing on slick? What does it look like? How is your foot going to make contact with that surface? You have to be prepared, because if you're prepared, you can adjust. Let's say you get to a tee pad that's super slippery. Maybe don't throw your highest full power, full speed drive. Take a little bit off of it. Maybe there's a slippery spot just at the end of the tee pad. Okay, then maybe I need to shorten my run up and plant in the middle of the tee pad to avoid that spot. It's all about confidence when throwing disc golf shots, and that confidence starts from the ground up. If you have bad footing, your confidence will be shaken and you're going to throw worse shots. The final thing to mention with footing is obstacles. Do you have something like this where there's tree roots on the ground? Is there something that's going to be in your path? Use your run up to your advantage and plan it out ahead of time. If I know I have a run up that's going to involve some weird undulations in the ground or some obstacles, make sure you plan that run out first so that by the time you're approaching your real shot and going through your X step, you're not surprised when your foot lands on a root. Footing is just one of the parts of disc golf that seems so subtle, but it's those little 1% efforts and differences that you'll make in your game that will add up and save you strokes over time. And like I said, everything starts from the feet up. That is why footing is a factor. All right, my next tip is certainly helpful in the summer months, but also in inclement weather, mostly rain, and that is choose wet or dry when referring to your putter. That is way too straight. Go left. I know that sounds a little bit weird, so let me explain. This is important. So there are two different scenarios to address here, rain and sweat. We'll start with rain. When you are playing in the rain, keeping your discs dry is one of the most difficult parts of the game. Now, I can imagine most of you would agree that when throwing a full power shot, especially a drive, your goal is to get your disc as dry as possible because you need maximum grip and contact between your hand and the rim of the disc to correctly throw it and get spin on the disc. But what happens when you get to the putting green? I also think most of you would agree that on the putting green, the amount of spin and force you're putting on the disc is much less, so you don't need the same kind of contact between your hand and the disc. This allows for the opportunity for you to decide, do I care about keeping my putter dry? And the reason I think it's important to decide has to do with more of your mental game than anything. If you are somebody that wants to keep your putter dry, you need to work to keep it completely dry, because if your goal in your head is, I don't like putting with a putter that has any water on it, I need my putter to be dry, then the second you feel a little bit of moisture on that putter, it's going to be in your head. You're going to be thinking about that over your putt. It's a distraction. It's the last thing you think. So there is a reason why I've actually talked to a lot of disc golf professionals who will let their putters get wet during a rainy round. And the reason why is, if you've accepted the fact that your putter is wet, if you've adapted to the fact that your putter is wet, maybe you have to put a little more effort into your putt to get the spin, maybe a little more height on the putt, whatever it might be, then any extra amount of rain that may land on your putter is not going to add any additional stress to you. You've already accepted what's happening. You're putting with a wet putter. It's different, but you're good with it. Now, I'm not saying that way is better than the other. Certainly easier to keep track of, but if you truly are a bad putter with a putter that has any kind of moisture on it, then, like I said, it's just important to really, really be careful and fight to keep your putter dry, because making a decision between the two is important. Now, there's also another scenario, and that's sweat. Oof. my putter's dry. That didn't help. You see, sweat is a bit more tricky because instead of rain falling from the sky, you have moisture coming out of your hands. So instead of trying to dry off a disc, you're trying to keep your hands dry more than anything. And what do you normally use for that? Some kind of chalk or rosin bag. Now here's where this gets tricky. The goal of using chalk on your hand is, of course, to dry it out, to keep it from getting slippery so that you can get a better grip on your putter. The problem is, especially depending on the kind of chalk you're using, the mixture of sweat and chalk becomes actually more tacky than anything. It's actually designed to do that. If you've ever seen a baseball player use a rosin bag, they're doing that in order to get tack, because you mix it with the sweat, it creates something that gets them a better grip on the ball, almost something sticky almost, so they can really rip over those curveballs and such. Now, not all chalk that you're using for disc golf purposes is going to have that effect, but I found that a lot will, and that's what will happen if you find that perfect mixture of you have a lot of sweat, you've been applying heavy chalk all around. You may all of a sudden step up to a putt and do one of these and wonder, why did that disc just stick to my hand? And that's because you've gone a little too far down the rabbit hole of chalk. So what I found the best thing to do is to kind of find a little in between where you're keeping your hand somewhat dry, but you're not applying too heavily that it gets caked up, creates that tacky substance in your hand, and leads to the disc sticking during a putt. It's a very tricky balance, but if you could find it, it's not a big deal. So two slightly different scenarios with the rain and with sweat. You have to find what makes you most comfortable, but that's just how I've approached it. And, take what you will from that. There are much better putters that also take that same approach. So just remember that. Tip number 3 is pretty simple, and that is to feed the part of your game which works best. Now, I've talked about playing within your game before, but this is a little bit more specific than that. This is taking literally the most specific, best parts of your game and using them as many times in a round as possible. It's a pretty simple concept, right? If I'm the best at throwing a backhand turnover shot with a mid-range more than any other shot in my bag, and I know that that's going to give me the highest rate of success, imagine if that went in. Ooh, I'm on one today. Then I want to try and throw that mid-range backhand turnover as many times as possible. And if you're playing a really specific woods course, this tip might not be best for you. There might not be a lot of opportunity. But if you're playing a more open park style course like this, you'll find that on this shot I just threw right here, I could throw a hyzer flip to turn, a flex forehand, a hyzer flip forehand, a flat forehand, almost a straight backhand, or a force over backhand turnover like that. There's a lot of options. So find the shot that you're best at and use it as many times as you can, because the more you can be leaning on a shot that you love to throw, the better you're going to be feeling about it and the better you're going to play and score. So yeah, use it. Now, with that being said, if the best part of your game is 30-foot putts, that doesn't mean to throw it to 30 feet on purpose just so you can putt. Take the tap-ins when they come. You'll thank me later. This next tip I find very helpful. It's kind of stolen from a golf technique, and that is use the clock to find your angle. Now, Trevor, what the heck are you talking about? How am I going to use my watch to help with angles on the disc golf course? Well, that's not what I mean. It's, of course, metaphorical, but think about how often during a round you throw a shot and you need to throw a certain angle. You know, every shot takes a certain angle, whether that is completely flat, some hyzer, a lot of hyzer, and hyzer, whatever it might be. Every shot has some kind of angle on it. And usually, most disc golfers will just think of it in a sense of either not thinking about it at all and just thinking, okay, I need to throw a hyzer, I'm throwing hyzer. Or some disc golfers may say, I need to throw a baby hyzer or a spike hyzer, and they kind of use that language. The most specific disc golfers may get to angles. You know, I need to throw a 20 degrees of hyzer, but I think the most simple way to do this is to picture a clock, okay? So picture the clock. It's really half of a clock. If I'm right-handed throwing a backhand, you know, this is the arm on the clock, and right now I am pointed at 9 o'clock. This would be 12 o'clock, this would be 6 o'clock down here. So you can kind of see what I'm getting at. Using the clock as a reference kind of gives you a visual, something that's familiar and repeatable. Okay, I need to throw a little bit of hyzer. Let me throw something at 8 o'clock. A little more hyzer, maybe I need to get all the way down to 7 o'clock. I need to throw it a little bit of anhyzer. Okay, up here to 10 o'clock. It just gives you something to visualize. And although you're not going to perfectly replicate it, if I say I want to throw it at 10 o'clock, I'm not saying I need to perfectly throw it there. It's just giving your mind something to cue on and something to look back on, because whatever system your body ends up developing, let's say every time I want to throw a shot with just a little bit of hyzer, I tell myself, okay, I want to throw it at 8 o'clock. And in reality, the disc comes out here, but it works out. Your system will kind of calibrate itself, but it's all about giving yourself the mental cue and the kind of like visual of the clock to give yourself something to reference. That's what it's all about, because you know, the angles that you're putting these discs on is really precise. You should help yourself out a little bit. So for example, on this hole, I'm trying to throw this disc through the gap on 7:30, 8 o'clock-ish. Angle felt okay, just a little bit high, but you get the point. Like I mentioned, this tip comes from, or this concept comes from golf. It's a really old technique. In golf, one of the most difficult parts of the game is hitting short wedges onto greens, because a lot of times you can't take full swings with clubs. You have to dial it in based on the gapping in your club. So if somebody has a wedge in their hand, they're using it to gauge their backswing. Okay, this would be their half of a clock coming away from their body, whereas in disc golf, we're talking about it more in this sense because the angle is what we're trying to gauge, not necessarily our backswing, but that's the idea. I think a lot of disc golfers could benefit from having a little more consistency. Oh my gosh, I thought I threw that in. I've just found that such a big part of disc golf is actually having intentionality when it comes to aiming your disc and throwing, instead of just going out there and feeling what's best. Some people can do that, a lot of people can't, and it's good to have something to reference, something to go back to. All right, for this next tip, we got to move down here. Now, I'm incredibly guilty of not following this one, but I'm trying to be better about it. As you can see right now, my bag is in a little bit of disarray. The drivers and the mid-ranges are separated, but nothing really has a specific spot. And realistically, it should. My tip here is keep an organized bag to make the best choice. And the reason I say that is, have you ever gotten to a hole, and maybe this is just me, but I feel like this happens to multiple people. I've seen this happen on the course. You get up to a hole, you throw a shot, you get back to your bag, and you think, oh, man, I should have thrown that disc. I didn't see it in there. It didn't pop to my forefront. Or sometimes you finish up a round, you notice a disc tucked in the side of your bag, and you're like, oh my gosh, I forgot that was in there. I needed to be utilizing that disc more on the course today. Maybe that doesn't happen to you, but it does to me. And that is why having an organized bag helps. And let me explain why. When I first started playing competitive disc golf, I was very specific about the order my bag was in. Every disc had an exact slot. It stayed in that slot to where I knew exactly where it went. It's not that hard to memorize. You know, I went by speed and stability. And then every time I put my disc back, I knew exactly where it went. This does two things. Number one, if I'm visualizing a shot in my mind, I'm not going to get a disc lost in translation. You know, drivers, a lot of times they look similar. They kind of fit in the same part of your bag if you have the same color disc. Sometimes you can just skip over one when you're trying to make a tough decision on the course and pick a driver. That might not happen for all your discs, but it can for some, especially if a disc is newer to your bag. But if you know exactly where every disc goes, you're just not going to pass over it easily. And this is the other bonus part of this tip. If that doesn't really apply to you, here's the other part of this tip that I think will. If you have ever left a disc on the course by accident, you get in your car, you drive home, and then all of a sudden it hits you like a ton of bricks. Oh my gosh, I left my favorite mid-range on the course. The easiest way to do that is when you're doing field work and at the end of the day, looking through your bag. Some people count discs, that works too, but you're looking through your bag and everything looks okay. And then you get home and you realize, oh my gosh, I am missing that one. You know, like I said, it hits you. If you have a specific spot for every disc in your bag, it will stick out like a sore thumb when a disc is not where it should be. It hits you right away. You'll never forget a disc ever again. I need to get back to this practice. I think it's super helpful and just convenient on the course. And like I said, it's not that difficult to get started with. So that's my tip. Comment down below if you're super specific about how you organize your bag. Because like I said, I used to be huge on it. I've just gotten lazy with it. But once you have the system in place, it's super easy. And I know a lot of people that are even more specific than I ever was, you know, keeping colors in a certain spot as well, and like doing themed bags. It's always a good time. All right, my next tip is something that saved me more strokes than probably anything else when I played competitively as a college disc golfer, and that is jump putt whenever possible. If you don't have a great jump putt, this would be the time to develop one. It is an incredibly useful tool. I know not everybody has the insane wrist strength of some of these pros to be able to throw 150-foot jump putts, but even if you can develop something you can use from 80 or 90 feet and in, or even 70 feet and in, this is going to help you a lot, because I think a lot of people, they step up to a shot, let's say this one right here. I'm about 100 feet from the basket. I've got OB left and deep. It's not the easiest upshot. If I were to throw a full swing upshot, that's not really the strength of my game, and it can be difficult. You know, I might get a little iffy on it and lose it into the water, or leave it short or wide because I'm a little scared of it. The benefit of jump putting, the primary benefit, is you get to face your target when throwing, similar to a forehand, but the other benefit is you're throwing it straight from your chest. And I think you'd probably agree that it's a little easier to throw a shot when it's coming straight out of the center of your body rather than out here. Because when you're out here, you have to hit your line a little more specifically. It's a little easier to let it go early or to pull it over. Whereas when you're staying on a similar plane the entire time, it's harder to miss left or right. So that's why jump putting is so helpful. And a lot of times you just don't realize that jump putting is the best option. You get up to a shot like this, like I mentioned, and okay, upshot, let's throw it. But sometimes you need to ask yourself the question, can I jump putt this? Because if I can, the shot becomes a lot simpler. All of a sudden, it's a jump putt, and it's 5 feet from the basket, and it wasn't very difficult. And like I said, this is about a 90 to 100 foot shot. I don't have some insane jump putt, but it's just so much more consistent. There's another one. Gets around the pole. It's about 10 feet from the basket. If I were throwing up shots, and like I said, some people are incredible at throwing the touchy putter shots. Maybe this isn't for them, but I've just found that jump putting is super simple. You'll see players like Gannon Buhr, whenever he gets close enough to the basket, he's throwing a jump putt because he knows, or even a step putt in his case, because he knows that it is the most consistent way to hit a line and to ensure you get up and down. And this is how you scrap out those pars on the course where it's boring, you're 100 feet from the basket, you know you're probably not going to make birdie, but it's important to get up and down and not let those little dumb errors and strokes pile up on your scorecard. My next tip is another one useful on upshots, but also short drives on par threes, and that is to get the disc vertical to avoid ground play. Now, there are a few facets to this tip. Obviously, one of the most unpredictable parts of disc golf is what happens on the ground. We play a lot of courses that are in the woods, that may have uneven soil. The grass could be a little bit long. You never know quite what you're going to get. And it's important to take note of the ground, but sometimes you can avoid it completely. One of the more old-fashioned shots in disc golf is the more vertical hyzer shot. And you don't see it as much anymore, but there's a reason it's so good, because once you can learn the shot, now obviously if the conditions are windy, this gets a little tougher, but once you can learn the shot, it has a very consistent landing, which is usually splat. It just sits right there, maybe it pops up and it just kind of dies. It doesn't really go anywhere, and heck, if the ground's soft enough, it'll just stick right in it. On a hole like this, for example, instead of having to worry about the disc skipping away towards the water, as long as I start it wide enough, and like I said, this takes a little practice to understand what your discs do that high in the air. It can be scary at first, but once you learn it, you'll realize throwing overstable plastic up in the air without a ton of wind, it's a very consistent finish. And even if it is in wind, if you learn it and you understand how to read the wind, it's not that bad. What'll happen is you're going to get the disc to land just like that, in a much more predictable fashion. It hits, it sits right there. It's not going to skip anywhere on you. You're not counting on it to. You're playing to land the disc in a spot, not land the disc somewhere and then move to a spot. Now, the second part of this tip is more related to upshots, and it's not as dramatic as throwing big spike hyzers. It's more just getting the disc a little bit more vertical and playing it out and swinging it in towards the basket. So a lot of people would step up to an upshot like this without a lot of obstacles. They'd see the target there. Okay, nothing in my way, so I'm going to throw the disc straight at the target, right? Just aim, throw it at the target. Now, I tried to hit the target there. What happened? The disc faded a little left. That's a difficult shot. Now, there are a few things going on here. Number one, you're aiming at a small target. Now, aiming small and missing small is good, but the key thing is the disc does not want to stay on line, right? If a perfectly thrown disc of the right characteristics is thrown well, it will go very straight and then kind of fall. But most discs are going to want to move in one direction. And when you have an open shot like this, the easiest direction to work with, of course, is hyzer. The point is, when you're throwing an upshot like this, you put a lot less pressure on yourself throwing a hyzer, just knowing that you have to get the disc somewhere out wide enough into all that airspace and then let the disc do the rest of the work for you instead of taking dead aim at the basket and all the pressure is on you to throw it directly at your target. So, 2 tips in one here. Number one, the verticality of that disc is going to help your landing at your target. It's very consistent. Not always for use, but you could use it more often. And number 2, when you have that open upshot, don't put so much pressure on yourself by aiming straight at the target. Use those hyzers, aim out in airspace, let the disc do the work for you. You take a little bit of pressure off yourself. Well, this next tip is real simple, and I'll just put it this way. Just throw the passion. Just try the passion. I waited so long to try this disc. I don't know why. It's probably the best fairway I've ever thrown. It's legitimately changed my game. You have to throw this disc if you have not. It is incredible. I mean, how beautiful is that? It does it all. It does it all, and I love it. The next tip is one of my favorites. It's the counterpart to a tip I did on the last one of these videos, which was to use an understable disc to move left, and this is simply use an overstable disc to move to the right. Sounds counterintuitive, let me explain. I'm talking about a right-hand backhand throw. Let's think about the mechanics of a left to right shot, an Anheuser shot. Typically you think understable, which makes sense because that is easier to get a flippy disc to want to turn to the right. But what happens when you need to get really right, okay? Or what happens when you need to get really right, but you don't want to go too right, you need it to kind of drop or maybe fade back just a tad at the end to avoid OB. That's when you need to go to overstability, because what happens is, if I have a dramatic Anheuser shot and I have a flippy disc in my hand, you can throw it higher to try and accomplish letting it pan out and not roll. But at some point, if you need it to move far enough right, you're just not going to be able to get that disc to do it. So what you do is you throw something overstable and you give it extra angle. You have to commit to the shot or it will not work. Because what happens is this disc, if thrown like this, is going to spend all of its flight to a point trying to work its way back to flat and back to the fading angle there. What happens the entire time it's doing that is the disc is going to be following what it's pointing at, right? So if a disc is flying through the air flat, it's going to go flat. If a disc is flying through the air like this, even if it's an overstable disc, it's going to be moving right. So you're buying yourself time. Whereas a flippy disc, it's here from the beginning until it hits the ground and it's probably going to catch nose and want to go that way. This disc is going to get air back under it, move back to the left at the end. So it's just going to keep fighting and moving right the entire way. And like I said, if you're trying to throw shots that move right and then have a subtle drop or finish left at the end, it's also a great use for this. I'm going to throw a couple overstable shots here on a hole that has a slight left to right, and I'll just show you how easy it is if you just commit to the angle. Look at that, perfect. Pans out. You would have thought that disc was understable the way it flew, but it's because I committed to the angle and it spent its entire flight panning out, landed to the ground nice and flat. We'll do this quake next, typically very overstable. Similar thing, going right the whole way. That one went a little too far right. And just to get the point across, I'll even throw a Toro. See, it's flattening, but the entire time it's doing that, it's moving to the right. That is a very useful shot to have in your bag. It's going to improve your left to right game. For this final tip, I'm going to explain a scenario to you and let me know if this sounds familiar. So let's say you like to practice putt, but you have limited space, maybe in a basement or in another hallway in your home or a small yard area. You've only got about 20 to 25 feet to practice putting. So what you find is you get really good at that putt. In fact, even if you don't have limited space, most of the practice putting you're going to be doing is typically from 15 to 25 feet because you get most of your important putts during the round from that distance. And what can happen a lot of times, it's happened to me many times, is you get to the point where you're throwing those putts, you're throwing those shorter putts and you're dialed, you're on the pole. You're like, oh my gosh, I have putting figured out. Nothing can stop me. And then all of a sudden, you're at 20 feet. You take a few steps back to 25, or you're at 25 feet and you take a few steps back to 28, 29 feet, and you're like, oh my gosh, the disc won't get to the basket. And then you feel this pressure to, okay, I need to generate more power. How do I generate the power? And then it throws off your putt and it becomes this entire identity crisis. Well, let me just encourage you that if you are having that issue and you have an awesome 23 footer, but your 28 footer stinks because it can't get to the basket and you feel like you have to change your putt, let me recommend trying one thing: throwing the disc higher. Now, this is not the Band-Aid that fixes all. It only works to a point. You don't want to be throwing elevator putts 10 feet above the basket. But if you're finding that your putt, the way you like to throw it, the way you've practiced and you're confident throwing, is dead center from like 20 feet, 25 feet, and you move a little further back and you're just hitting that cage, you're just almost there. Just think about throwing that same putt, but just aiming a little higher. That's a lot of times much easier than learning somewhere new in your putt to generate power. And you'll just have the disc falling into the basket. Very simple, but not a lot of people think about it, including me. It's something that I was taught a lot later on, but it is helpful and I really should turn to it more often. All right, everybody, that's all the tips I have for today. Please comment down below which tips you enjoyed or didn't know before. Also, give me some other great tips that you've learned along the years. I love to learn new things. Also, make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and check out the rest of the tutorial style videos I have on this channel if you enjoyed this one. I'll see you next Monday with another video.